Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Brad is back. It has been it's been 2 years. Time flies when you're having fun or
Has been
yeah.
almost 2 years. Yeah, I think it was November when we did that.
Would you mind reintroducing yourself to the audience out there and kind of
No, it's great to be back. Thank you for the invitation. You had a standing invitation open, and I eventually decided to take you up on it. I'm Brad Parker. I've done a lot of work on the Parkland side of the medical evidence, including interviewing a lot of the Parkland physicians. Um, I did some Dealey Plaza interview witnesses and decided I was getting stories all over the place. So I decided to go for trained observers, and that led me to Parkland. I also interviewed, or attempted to interview, I should say, because they weren't necessarily the most hospitable people, two members of the three autopsy prosecutors. Um, but they really didn't want too much of that. And then there's some weird ones like General Walker and some strange ones like that. But mostly it's been Parkland. And I work closely with Dr. Charles Crenshaw on his lawsuit against JAMA, which he ultimately prevailed. I also worked on the George Hickey lawsuit against the publishers of Moral Error back in the day. So that's kind of not really in a nutshell, but that's who I am.
can I ask about your interest in Parkland and also how you got your book first published? I think we talked about Deborah Conway ended up helping you out a little bit with it, but I would like to know some of your influences who kind of picked up on it.
Actually, one of the very first people to pay attention to what I did, and I don't recall exactly how we got in touch. I mean, we're talking 1992. Gary Aguilar, Dr. Gary Aguilar. I believe if you're an MD, you earned that, so you should be addressed by your title. Uh, because I went down that road myself for a while. I know how tough it is. Gary Aguilar got a hold of me about my contact that I had with Dr. Ron Jones. And Dr. Ron Jones, I had a gentleman the other day tell me that Ron Jones has flipped and he's now a lone nutter. And I don't know that for fact. I do know that you need to read between the lines as to what as Dr. Jones says. He's very, very particular in the words that he selects. And so what he may be saying to you initially on face value, when you especially when you interviewed them and you type up the transcript, you go, gee, this is not what I thought it was at all. But I had interviewed Dr. Ron Jones, and that was well, I guess it would have been 93 was the first year that they had COPA in Washington, D.C. In fact, I think it was maybe Dr. Cheryl Weck that got us in touch, Dr. Aguilar and I. I'd contacted Dr. Weck because he'd always been someone that I'd seen on television and trusted. And he said, get with Aguilar. So I did. And Dr. Aguilar had me write just about a page abstract of what Dr. Jones had to say. Now, I'd done other interviews up to that point. That one was by far the most interesting one. And he presented that at COPA 93. And from there, led to I was already in touch with JFK Lancer for some reason. Maybe I just subscribed to their journal, which in those days I believe was called Assassination Chronicles or Kennedy Assassination Chronicles. They've changed names a time or two. But I was doing interviews with other people. Dr. Robert McClelland. I tried to do one with Dr. Jim Carrico that kind of went and kind of didn't. Don Curtis, uh, Marty White. Again, and these guys all earned that MD, so I should be putting that title in there. But these guys were all, willing to talk to me. Dr. Giesecke, um, but and of course I got to be very close to Dr. Charles Crenshaw. But in the meantime, so I'm writing these articles, and they're appearing in John Kellen's Fair Play, which is an online in those days research journal that came out about once a month. And I would give them to him. I would send them to Russell Kent, with who I know you're acquainted with Dealey Plaza UK, and Deborah Conway. Deborah Conway seemed to have a real interest in it, and I mean more than just a passing thing. And they appeared in uh, several issues of their journal, as it did in Dealey Plaza UK, and pretty much anything I sent to John made it online. Of course, it's so much easier to publish online than it is to do it in print, as Assassination Chronicles did in these days. And Deborah, that's the way it flowed. I mean, I spoke in Dallas several times. Well, I spoke one time in a big, event, a paper that's never been published anywhere except in the book, The Subjective Degree of Medical Certainty. Everything else has appeared somewhere else. But she called me in, I would say 2002 as a guest. And she says, "Hey, I'm getting a lot of requests for your articles." And I said, "Oh, okay." I was a police officer at the time. I was kind of busy with work. I was a supervisor. I'm like, okay, so Xerox them? I mean, I don't know what the answer is. And she said, "Well, I'd like to put them together in an anthology." And I said, "Are you kidding?" Because by that time I'd gotten to know Vincent Palomara. And Vincent, since the very first day, I have trouble calling him Vince, but since the very first day, has always been like, in the research community, he's always sort of been like my biggest cheerleader, and I'll always be very grateful for that. And I'd already appeared in his ultimate medical evidence compendium, or whatever he called that sort of self-published thing he did in about 2000. But he had a good working relationship with Lancer, and I had had good luck with them speaking. I'd done some panels and stuff with people like Lifton and Lane and Jim Marsh and stuff. And they always treated me just like dynamite. I mean, great. And she said, "I'd like to put them together." And I said, "There are three of us that are this far into the Parkland evidence. There's myself, there's Palomara, and there's Gary Aguilar. And the three of us, we all know what each other have. I mean, we're all these days. It was the snail mail. This was a long time ago." And she said, "I think it would, but more than anything, you make some citations in your articles, some Warren Commission testimony, some AARV stuff here appears here and there. White House Transcript 1327C, which I believe is essential to understanding what happened at Parkland. And you need
Could you explain that transcript?
that transcript is you see the silent film all the time. Okay, it's taken probably 2 o'clock that day. And what it is Malcolm Perry, Dr. Malcolm Perry, who was in charge of Kennedy's treatment. And I'm sorry for the repeat, folks. This was I was on episode 1238, so I'm trying not to repeat too much, but there will be some. Malcolm Perry and Kemp Clark, who was the chief of neurosurgery, who actually pronounced him as deceased, they went out and addressed the media. Now, there is no audio of that, but there was a White House stenographer there that was part of the press pool. So there is a transcript of that. And in that, Malcolm Perry said, he had a bullet hole in the throat. And well, okay, did it appear to be coming at him? It appeared to be coming at him. He had a hole in the back of the head. It's pretty clear cut when you read it what you think these doctors believe. Now, they don't come out and say he was shot from the front, but their descriptions of the wounds, considering they're addressing a bunch of laymen, were fairly precise. And in those days, I had to write or I called, and then I had to send a money order to cover, because it's on legal paper and it's like 12 pages long or something. I had to get that from the LBJ library, and that's the only place you could get it. And not many people had it. Also, Dr. Carero had recommended that I hunt down the January 1964 edition of the Texas State Journal of Medicine, also known as Texas Medicine. And he said, our reports are in that. Well, if you do that, it's essentially it's just copies of their reports. There's nothing new in that. So basically, I already had that, but I believe that's included in there. But now all of this stuff is available online. In 2002, 2003, these reference sites, maryfarrell.org, National Archives, these things were not what they are now. And these things were hard to come by. I mean, I had to really work to get a hold of some of these things. And so at the time, I joked to Deborah when I went down and I had a book signing the first year that it came out, that it's going to be this much of me and then about this much of the reference material, which is fine. But I didn't want people thinking, well, he's just padding this. And she said, no, one of the most important things you can do is get this stuff in the hands of people so that they can read it themselves. It's one thing to have someone sort of regurgitate to you what a transcript says, what somebody's testimony says, whatever. But when you can actually pull it up yourself and see the context. See, that's a weird line of questioning by future Senator Specter. That makes it a little bit more, it hits home with people more. So that's a very, very long-winded explanation as to what you asked.
I'd like to address some things about Parkland I don't think we talked about on the first time you were on, but now I have a little bit more information on things. And one recent clip I had posted up that you had commented on was on Daryl Tomlinson. Um,
Yes.
Maybe we can go into Daryl Tomlinson a little bit because obviously with the Paul Landis coming out about placing the bullet on the stretcher, he's talked about it in like 97, but there's conflicting accounts on was this bullet found on this stretcher and digging through Daryl Tomlinson's testimony. They don't ever really talk about finding the bullet on the stretcher. Our inspector just kept asking him, "Are you sure you found it on this stretcher and you didn't find it on this one?" He asked him that like 8 times. I'm like, dude, the guy said he found it on this one stretcher. And you keep asking him the same time, like waiting for him to go, wait, maybe, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Now, it's been years and years and years since I read 6 Seconds in Dallas, but I found of the times that Tomlinson's name has come up, one of the best studies of him was in 6 Seconds in Dallas by Josiah Thompson, published in 1967, which if you can get your hands on a copy, It's amazing. I have tried to get him to get that republished, but he's always kind of laughed me off. But Tomlinson found this bullet, and of course, knowing what had just happened, wasted no time in taking this to a supervisor. And that supervisor grabbed a Secret Service agent, and I can't remember his name. I want to say
O.P.
his name
Wright.
was no, that's the Parkland, not the chief of staff. He's
There's two
the
names in there. It's O.P. Wright and Bardwell Odom.
Odom. I'm not familiar with, but there was an agent that they grabbed, and they said, "This guy, our guy, just found this bullet." And they said, "Okay, take us back where the bullet was found." Now you gave the time frame in the video between what 1:30 and 2 o'clock or something. So by that time, this is a working, things didn't just stop because the president and the governor came in. I mean, they still had car accidents. They had all kinds. They had a little boy that had been in a bicycle accident that had been logged in, I believe, just before John Kennedy was.
They had a guy with a seizure too that came in there.
Oh yeah, the disappearing seizure guy that was picked up right across the street from the depository. And oddly enough, I talked to Aubrey Reich about that, and Aubrey was of the opinion that that guy was in on it, and that they had been timed because they'd gotten several calls to Dealey Plaza area in the weeks prior to that. And so the idea was time them and see how long the ambulance takes to get there. But back to the bullet, they said, "Show us where you found this bullet," because anytime you have a bullet, you want, I mean, any evidence, you want to know who recovered it, when was it recovered, and where was it recovered. That's probably the most important thing. Where was it recovered? Because if it was recovered 3 stories away in a classroom, obviously it's probably not going to be related. So you want to place it in proximity enough that it counts. So they went there, and by then the gurneys had been all shuffled around, and they're like, "Which gurney was it?" And he was like, I'm not thinking that it's even here. And Josiah Thompson, in his book, comes to the conclusion that it actually was from that it had turned up on the gurney used by the little boy who'd been in the bicycle accident, which lends itself to the notion of somebody snuck in there, be it Jack Ruby or anybody else, and planted it. But as you point out in your video, Tomlinson couldn't identify that bullet, which is the same, which, if you're not a gun person, that may be not surprising, but if you will recall, General Walker was unable to identify the bullet that was fired at him either. But that, CE 399 did come from somewhere. I'm not saying that bullet was switched. I don't know. I just know that there's more lead in the governor's wrist than is missing from. I mean, to this day, the governor's buried with lead in his wrist. And there's more lead in that wrist than is missing from CE 399. So that was the Tomlinson thing, that he went back and, well, now the gurney's missing, and which may not be surprising because like I said, you've got a working emergency room. Just because the president has just passed away doesn't mean that they can tell this guy that's over here bleeding to death from a car accident to, well, just hold on, we've got some stuff going on. So I'm sure it was chaotic there on a good day. And then you throw in everything going on that day, and it's a
Now,
lot more difficult.
I appreciate your approach because you come at it with more like a less balance when it comes to the conspiracy stuff. But did you ever ask anybody from the testimony of Wilma Tice of Mr. X being brought in to, I don't think it's Wilma Tice's testimony, but there was a Mr. X that was brought in. A receptionist had seen a bleeding person that she thought was a Secret Service agent that was shot in Dealey Plaza. That's how you like, there's, okay.
That was something that I didn't quite pick up on until much later. And since you've mentioned this receptionist or whatever, I do want to correct one thing that was brought to my attention just a few days ago. A gentleman contacted me and stated that a very well-known author had cited me, which in a book that's been out about 10 years. And I was unaware that I'd been cited in this book. And he said that I had contacted one of the nurses who had been involved in Kennedy's treatment. And I'm sure it was an honest mistake. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but that is incorrect. I did not contact any nurses, and it has nothing to do with chauvinism or that women can't make great witnesses. It has to do with the fact that these were a lot of young nurses, and many of them, in fact, married, and their names changed. So the nurses were not really much of an option. The only female that I had contact with at Parkland was Jackie Hunt, the MD. But no, the Mr. X, there is this story that keeps popping up about a Secret Service agent maybe being hit in the deal somehow. That was on the initial news broadcasts and all that, and I don't know where that came from, unless that was from possibly Clint Hill being seen, he by the way that he had positioned himself on the car. I'm sure that he had blood all over him. But this Mr. X guy, no, I didn't really become tremendously aware of this guy until much later, unfortunately.
When I mentioned about you having a balance to the conspiracy stuff, it's because the example you mentioned to me on our first time talking, which is about Earl Rose and the Secret Service flashing guns on him, and you said their job was to protect the president, or try and get Jackie out of there because the president that was going to be Johnson can't get off on Air Force One. He wouldn't leave without Jackie. So their main goal at that point was to bring Jackie back to Air Force One with any means necessary. But you mentioned you interviewed Earl Rose. I want to know what that was like.
Yes. Earl Rose, it was relatively short. He was a very, I believe he was from Iowa, and he was a very mild-mannered, soft-spoken, extremely humble gentleman. You look around today and you go, wow, that's a guy from a different time. But he did say that he did feel as though probably any questions that had existed would have been answered had the chain of evidence not been broken. He did attribute the questions, the theories, all the bad stuff that has come out of sort of the theoretical side of this thing, probably started with the break in that chain of evidence. And I certainly, I understand the Secret Service guys, and they needed to get moving. But at the same time, had we had the doctors in Dallas turn the body over to Earl Rose, and then you go down the hall to the morgue, and everything is done properly there because she was eminently qualified. Um, that a lot of stuff would have been cleared up. There wouldn't have been, and two, there wouldn't have been this military presence. People make a big deal out of this military presence at the autopsy, right, wrong, or indifferent. That well, I saw a thing the other day. Somebody said, "Well, Admiral Berkeley was controlling the autopsy." No, he wasn't. Uh, there was supposedly a general, and I say supposedly because I wasn't there. Um, but Earl Rose, that would have been an entirely civilian group in attendance, other than Admiral Berkeley, who was the president's physician, who you would expect would be there, who would be a good consultant to have there in case they ran across a pre-existing condition. For instance, Dr. Boswell, one of the two autopsy pathologists, told me, and they did confirm in JAMA, that Kennedy did have Addison's disease. Now, that means there's a good chance he wouldn't have survived his second term. But why was that not in the autopsy report? It's not. That there's no mention of Addison's disease at all. But apparently, he really had virtually zero left for adrenals, and that would be why he was taking the shots. When he arrived in the trauma room, they shot him full of steroids. Well, Dr. Berkeley, in doing his, or not Dr. Berkeley, Dr. Rose, might like to have known, okay, we have a history of Addison's. That's why your tox is going to be full of steroids and whatever else he was on. By most accounts, he was on quite a concoction of things just to get him through the day. And you can see that with that disease, that's gonna wear you out pretty quickly.
What do you think Berkeley's involvement in all this was? I mean, he was present at everything, the autopsy at Bethesda, then obviously he was at Parkland too.
Yeah, I don't place too much on that other than the death certificate, which was signed by him, places the back wound at the level of the fourth thoracic vertebrae, which is significantly lower than Mr. Spector and President Ford would like to have you believe. But in those days, even in those days, presidents traveled with their physicians. So he was basically kind of the family doctor along for the ride. Now, Air Force One actually contains an operating suite. Now, I don't know why you would be, say, in a motorcade or something else, have something go wrong, and just getting back to the plane. I don't know why that would be the case instead of a hospital. But in those days, they didn't have an operating room, but the doctor had the big black bag, sort of like the nuclear football. Um, but Berkeley, he was actually delayed in getting to Parkland by several minutes. So when he arrived and said, "Hey, you might want to give him some steroids because he's got Addison's," uh, Jim Carero said, "We've already taken care of that." Because they could shoot him full of steroids and it wasn't going to hurt anything. It was sort of a precautionary measure. But, okay, Dr. Berkeley is actually one of the very few that one could argue. Now, you get into the thing at Park or at Bethesda of second ambulance, a second casket, maybe, body disappearing for 40 minutes, and these kinds of things. But if you take things at face value, Berkeley and a couple of the Secret Service agents, I believe Kellerman and Greer, who were in the car with Kennedy when he was shot, those guys attended the autopsy. But Berkeley, and I can't imagine how bad it was for Berkeley to, this is not only your president, but he's also your friend, his family, his kids. And here's this. Now, I've been to autopsies. They're no fun at all. You're watching this man be hollowed out, and 12 hours ago he was your living, breathing, vibrant friend. To the extent that he was in control of Bethesda, I am very skeptical. I think that the Bethesda thing, particularly if you go by what some of the witnesses state, and Dr. Humes, who was in charge of the autopsy, told me, oh, Paul O'Connor must have been at an entirely different autopsy than I was. Because Paul O'Connor, of course, has said, well, there was no brain to remove, which I find very puzzling, because most of the doctors at Parkland state that he had at least half a brain. That what had occurred here. So everything in this area
Other side,
should have been there.
right?
Yeah. So, but Paul O'Connor claimed there was no brain. Now, how do you account for that? I don't know. But Dr. Humes claimed that that Mr. O'Connor must have been at a different autopsy. But at the same time, if you go by what Mr. Lifton uncovered in some of his stuff with Gerald Custer and Dennis David and these people like this, there was something going on at that autopsy that was not normal. That was not there was some kind of control somewhere, and you know uh, they were stopped from exploring certain wounds. The one thing that I have, one of the biggest problems that I have is the exploration of the back wound with a finger, and that's from Seibert and O'Neill. Now they make probes for that. You're supposed to stick probe in, and does it come out? Do we find a slug? Do we hear the tap as it hits a bullet? Where does this go? But these guys are just, which to me, these guys are hospital pathologists. They spend their days looking through microscopes. Not to diminish what those folks do, they do an essential service for people. But that's not the qualifications you need to do a gunshot wound autopsy. Even if you more or less know, for instance, you and I could go into an autopsy and probably take a good stab, and pardon my choice of words there, that just fell out. We could probably come up with a good idea of, okay, this is an entrance, this is an exit. And we're not physicians. It's just based on ballistics. But if you're a physician who's been trained in that should be blatantly obvious. And instead they're doing this, and it's small enough you can't get your finger in it. Well, okay, so it's probably an entry wound. But No, Dr. Berkeley is in fact a very interesting character, but I don't believe he really had a tremendous amount to do with stuff. I think he was just kind of, well, that's like Kellerman and Greer. They were basically there as witnesses, I think.
It doesn't necessarily have to be evil conspiracy talk with Berkeley, but I believe he was way too close to the family to have be able to have the custody of any of type of evidence. The Harper fragment, for instance, was last seen with Berkeley. The brain supposedly was last seen with Berkeley when it got put into the container after the three pathologists that were at Bethesda signed off at the materials that were in this little steel box. There's a lot with Berkeley. I think he even rode back with he did he ride on Air Force One, but I thought he was also with the limousine at a point as well too. Or he stopped by maybe when it was at Ford Motor Company.
I think he stopped by the Secret Service garage that night, maybe. Because he didn't go back to Ford or to, I forget the name of the company. It's a three-word name. The group that did the armoring on the car in Cincinnati. Um, but no, he was on Air Force One. If you listen to the tapes of Air Force One in the air on the way back to Washington, I believe he's on the radio at one point. So he, and I think probably he wanted to stay close to Jackie. You know, she just come within inches of death herself. And if she'd have a meltdown, as many people would in that situation. I'm not saying anything about Jackie Kennedy. In fact, it's stunning how composed she was. But if she were to have a breakdown, he's going to need to be there. And in those days, they didn't mess around. They gave you tranquilizers, you know? And she certainly would have earned it. You know, after the day that she had. But Berkeley, you know, I don't know why he would have been in that loop of Harper Fragment. Okay, there's another thing. Do we even really know where the Harper Fragment is? I'm not sure of that because I interviewed the doctor who examined it at Methodist Hospital, and then I kind of lost interest in it. It may be in the National Archives.
No, it's lost. We
Brain,
only have photos of
doctor,
it.
of the brain or
The Harper fragment. We only have photos of the Harper fragment to even know it exists.
and how do you lose something like that in a case like that? You can keep track of a bullet, you can keep track of fragments, but a piece of human tissue. Um,
Well, that's like with the brain. I'm still finding evidence that people had, there was vials of the brain that people, Masovito, the guy who was in charge of the Secret Service files on all this type of stuff, all these files that he was over a period that he was covering those files, he was destroying them or what he would call purging documents of things that were no longer needed. And Blakey, during his investigation, went to Mastrovito and asked him, hey, I have this index cards that I gave to the Warren Commission members. They are all looking for these certain things on here. We need those, these little things that are on these cards, these file document numbers. And some of those documents were one of the some that he purged. So that's where Blakey had a problem with trying to get them to stop destroying documentation as they're trying to do an investigation on things. Because
yeah, and the timing on that alone is interesting. That's when they choose to destroy documents, not 1981, not 1974. It's during the House Assassinations Committee period itself that stuff is disappearing.
well,
Sort of like,
the ARRB was the one that declassified that. When I spoke to David Montague, he didn't mention this, but he wrote a letter about Mastrovito, and Mastrovito also claimed that he found a vial from the Army Forensic Pathology Institute down there, and the vial
yeah,
was
yeah.
was unidentified, or it's brain tissue, but it was labeled something on it like a specimen sample, and he had it in the files, but they don't know where that vial is.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing, and you think of 1966, Cyril Wecht gets permission from the Kennedy family somehow through Burke Marshall to examine some of the original material, and he goes to the National Archives, and of course, what does he want to dig into but the brain? And it's going to be in a decent sized container. Um, that's not a file folder, and it's gone. So it actually disappeared between late 63. Now they fixed it in formalin. We have a drawing of it. That was apparently, I think it was one of the docs drawings, the IDA docs drawings, uh, um, from the HSCA, but we have nothing, no photograph of it. Not that you can tell. But the interesting thing about the brain to me has always been that it weighed 1,500 grams. Now, if you're familiar with human brains at all, that's around 3 pounds, just maybe slightly over 3 pounds. Okay, now this is a brain that has had anywhere, depending on which doctor you listen to, anywhere from 30 to 50% of it blown out. The average human brain pre-injury or minus injury in most people's cases is around 3 pounds. So in the autopsy report, either that's a typo or that is just a glaring item that was not thought of very much when certain aspects of the autopsy report were fabricated. And I say that's going to be a controversial statement. Um, I'm going by what was seen in Dallas. Okay, there's no way to rectify what was seen in Dallas, the cerebellum falling out of the wound. Okay, that's clear at the base of the brain. Now you have the Dr. McClelland, you have several doctors, Dr. Crenshaw, they're seeing the cerebellum fall out, but yet at the autopsy it's intact. So therefore, in my mind, something had to have occurred during that autopsy, like, oh, well, we'll just say this. Um, or at some point, if it wasn't during the autopsy, maybe those guys did a tremendous autopsy that would rival. I mean, this is an extreme example that didn't happen. Something went askew with the autopsy that maybe it wasn't the pathologist. Maybe a higher up rewrote it later. I don't know. Maybe those guys did a fantastic job with the autopsy, but somehow, based on everything in Dallas, it doesn't fit.
Well, who was outspoken doctor wise when it came to what they saw at Parkland compared to who were the people you would put on your list of like, there's something not right about this guy, who either stuck to the official narrative or, was very anti-conspiracy and really followed the government thing? Because like if you look at like the Bethesda autopsy, I mean, that's you got all these guys with military backgrounds doing this. And I'm like, you don't have anybody that doesn't have a bias or some type of influence where the government could be like, this is what you saw and this is what you're going to say. I mean, you can't explain, what was it, Hume's burning his autopsy notes, the preliminary drafts, and then possibly taking Fink's, because Fink has stated that he made notes that night and his notes went missing. So he's openly stated that. And I think people have heard him over in the cafeteria complaining about that he couldn't find his notes and someone had swiped his notes. So there's like the Bethesda stuff to me is all like that's where like the really kind of cover up was. The Parkland so much so. I would like to know what the doctors that stated they saw something and then maybe their statements changed later in the Warren Commission compared to the people that were just openly from the beginning like the number one patriots of the Warren Commission.
Um, as far as number one people that back the official line, like from day one at Parkland, there's not one. There's not a single description done that day in their handwritten reports, or even if you read the testimony, there's nobody that really, they have to be given this spoon-fed line about, okay, theoretically speaking, is it possible for X, Y, and Z to occur and this to happen? Well, that's leading the witness into a corner that he has no choice but to agree with. But when you let these guys describe things, not a single Parkland witness describes the autopsy injuries that way that day, or even in the weeks after that. After that, most of those guys were very consistent. About the first time you start seeing changes is around HSCA time. So you're looking at close to 15 years. And that's Perry, that's Jenkins, I believe Carero to an extent. HSCA didn't interview that many people from Parkland. They interviewed kind of the key ones. I sent you a list last night of kind of the ones that I regard as more key than others. But not a single one of them said, "Oh yeah, he was clearly shot from behind. The temporal parietal region was blown out." Invariably, it's occipital parietal, which is the back of the head, or they say posterior. If they give a description, some of the doctors just say the president suffered a tremendous head injury. Some of them don't get that specific because maybe, for instance, and it's been a while since I've looked at his report, but let's say Paul Peters. Paul Peters is a urologist. Okay, so that's not his area of expertise. He might be more inclined to use a word like posterior. Now, Paul Peters, I believe, did use occipital parietal, but I'm saying some of the people whose specialty is not cranial anatomy might just say posterior, but nobody said, anterior, which if you want a head injury consistent with a shot from the depository, you have to have an anterior wound. You have to. And, even if you look at the Zapruder film, and one of the nastiest things that I ever saw in Dallas was at a Lancer conference. And it was a deal between Robert Groden and David Lifton. And they got into this argument over whether or not the Zapruder film had been altered. Now you have in the Zapruder film, as you well know, I'm sure you've seen it a million times, just like everybody else that's probably made it this far in the video. It does look like something opens up sort of like this. Clint Hill even said, when I climbed up there, there was bone attached to scalp and it was just hanging loose. Well, Jackie, what did Jackie say? Jackie said on her way to the hospital, she closed a wound. Now, the doctors that I've talked to specifically about Kennedy's hair he had a lot of hair, and someone who's been shot in the head is going to be bleeding, and he's laying in all kinds of positions during the trip to the hospital. So it is possible that no more than the doctors got into the head wound because they didn't feel the need to get into the head wound because they thought that as soon as he was declared dead, he would be wheeled down the hall to the morgue and he would get an excellent autopsy from Dr. Rose. There was no reason for them to really probe this in tremendous detail. Now, Dr. Crenshaw told me, it did not make his book, but he told me, and Giesecke also said the same thing, that they did shine a light in the back, but they didn't like start digging through the blood clots up here. So it is possible that something was closed up there. But that's still, even if you have an anterior wound here that was missed, and you gotta, I mean, people are gonna hear that and they're gonna say, how can you miss a wound like that? You gotta remember this room is the definition of chaos. And the blood clot, the amount of hair involved, how easily it would be to hide an injury. This is the part back here where the tissue is actually gone. I mean, it's blown out. You can see it in much more film. You can see it in the next film, it blows out onto the trunk. This is the attention grabber in Dallas. But nobody said, you've got a tiny wound back here and this is gone. Nobody in Dallas until much later.
I know there was criticism from some of the Parkland doctors on like when the report was released and stuff like that, but when it comes to overall, like anybody of any of the doctors, anyone you interviewed, did anybody get to see when the president was brought in, like the moment it happened, or were they all away from the front? Because I'm very curious to. I know there's one statement out there from like a nurse that talked about seeing a hole in the windshield, but I would love to know if there was anybody that got to examine the vehicle, and then also who officially brought over the bucket and decided that they were going to clean it out. Because I've seen the Dallas, I thought it was the Dallas police or something like that, but it turns out it was a statement from one of the or someone in Parkland, one of the doctors or someone that worked there stated that you should get a bucket and start washing this down or something like that. And I don't know if they ever followed through with it.
I don't know. There are pictures, of course, of the bucket sitting there, and Paul Amaro would be your guy on that one. I believe that car was in the custody of the Secret Service, and nothing is going on with that car that isn't Secret Service approved. And to me, even in those early days of sort of crime scene, there was no CSI unit in those days. I mean, they did the best they could with a guy from robbery homicide and maybe a guy from fingerprints or whatever. But they didn't do anything that wasn't Secret Service approved. So I would say that anything that was scrubbed down, and there was some stuff scrubbed down which should not have been. I mean, you've basically got three scenes of the crime. You've got the body, you've got the car, and you've got the plaza. And you don't scrub down your crime scene, just like that Elm Street was opened way too soon. You've got chunks of brain and blood and bone. Well, the Harper Fragment laying in the grass right off the street. You've got the famous picture of the FBI agent, the alleged, I believe his name supposedly Regis Kennedy, picking up a bullet out of the grass. But as far as the physicians, they got the call. Jim Carrico was the guy on duty in the emergency room, and he was a resident. Not that there's anything wrong with residents, but the attendings were all at lunch, and they get the call. Him and Bill Midget, and Bill Midget was an OB resident who'd actually delivered Marina Oswald's last baby a few months prior. A little bit of irony there. But they get the call the president's coming, and the cops show up, the Secret Service show up, and they busted the door, and they're like, we need a gurney. So they go rushing outside, and their attention is on, okay, first things first, we got to get the governor moved so we can move that seat forward, pull Kennedy out, then Jackie won't let go of the body. So we've got an issue there. So the physicians, their attention was taken up with the bodies, or I say bodies, with the victims at that time, because Kennedy was still a victim at that time. He was still alive. We got to remember. Now, if you get into, I believe it's the book We Were There, the one on that kind of tries to paint the picture for the Dallas doctors that, oh, we didn't really see all that much and everything has been overblown. It's the picture with it's the cover with Robert McClellan holding the shirt with the blood on it. There were some medical students. Jody Goldstrick, I think is his name. He was a medical student that, when this whole thing happens, these people kind of gravitate towards the emergency room area. Well, they see there's no room for them, so they go outside and they look at the car. And you do have some people that start seeing, okay, well, there's a bullet in there's a bullet hole in the windshield. There is a dent on the chrome, the molding above the windshield. Well, that clearly places somebody behind the car, and I've never disputed there was somebody behind the car, but you do have these things going on. Plus, you've got the missed shot and all this stuff. But there were people that did see at Parkland evidence that some bullets had not struck what they were supposed to, or if they had, they had. Now I would be curious on that windshield. Is that a full blown? Is that a clean through and through bullet hole? Is it round, or is it from a fragment? Is it irregular in shape? I don't think anybody was allowed to get close enough. They just saw the spidering effect of the glass. But yeah, as far as who saw what, you might consult that book.
What
It's been a
about
long time since I read that one. I read it when it first
what
came
about
out.
what about what the Parkland doctors had to say about the autopsy photos of Kennedy? If you ever got to hear or come across information on that.
Yeah, Robert Groden did a nice job in his video, A Case for Conspiracy. He actually, because there was a number of them, or there were a number of them, Mr. Grammer here, that went to the National Archives in 1988, and they reviewed the autopsy materials. And during that time, they come out one at a time, and they're like, "Well, yep, that looks good to me." It's a bit self-serving, But Robert Groden then takes the autopsy pictures to each doctor's office in Dallas after the Nova appearances, circa 1991, 92, maybe somewhere in there. And I remember Dr. Salyer in particular was like, he's looking at a picture of the tiny little entrance wound in the occipital bone, or wherever, depending on which version you go through with the HSCA or the Warren Commission. And he says, something is wrong. Something has been cut or pulled or something, and that's not what I remember. And several of them all indicated that the autopsy picture of the back of the head specifically was not what they saw that day. Now, you've got a little bit of a credibility thing coming in here. Well, the stories keep changing, you know. If it's for a national audience, we'll say it's changed. If it's a guy doing a research video that only a select few people are going to see, maybe we'll stick with what we originally said. But no, I would recommend Case for Conspiracy for that video, because you can hear it in their own words. I mean, they're sitting there like this, so you can see what they're looking at and what they're commenting on all in the same frame.
Yeah. I know Jenkins and Custer and that.
Yeah, and of course Custer was from Bethesda, but another one that a book, it's kind of a coffee table book, is The Killing of a President, and he has an extensive section in there on the people that this is not what I saw, and you will see time after time pictures that look like this, that this is gone, over and over and over and over again. It's quite striking, the consistency.
Did Earl Rose ever mention about when the Secret Service were forcing the body out of there? Did he ever mention anything that was more kind of just shows a bigger insight to what's going on there? Because I've seen conflicting accounts on how aggressive they were.
Well, yeah. And one of the most fearsome, I guess would be the term, is Dr. Crenshaw's book. Now, again, people criticize Crenshaw, and to me, you're getting down to perception. Assault is actually, and that would be aggravated assault in Kansas anyway. If these agents had their guns out and stuff, it depends on how afraid you are as to whether you've been the victim of an assault in Kansas. But, some of them were very, very afraid. Earl Rose did not strike me as a guy who was afraid of much of anything. And I did ask him about firearms. And he said, I've heard mention of that. I never saw any, but I was pretty focused on what I was doing. He was dealing with Roy Kellerman, and Kellerman was a formidable figure, quite tall and a very imposing presence. And he was saying, we're taking the president to Washington. And Earl Rose is like, no, we're not. Now, who knows? There could have been, monkeys and organ grinders off to the side, and he wouldn't have known it. He's fixated on, this is my deal. I'm the one that's ultimately responsible. I'm going to take the heat for this. And some of the other doctors who maybe weren't focused on Kellerman seem to indicate that at least the jackets were tucked back behind holsters. one of the kind of oddities that I found, and Dr. Crenshaw was a very good friend of mine, and we never discussed this, and I wish that we had, was, George Hickey pulled that AR-15 in Dealey Plaza. There's pictures of him with that gun, the so-called black gun that everyone's afraid of now. He pulled that gun. It was a brand, it was like 3 years old at the time. And he pulled that gun, and that gun, once the gun is out, it's really hard to put a rifle away on the move. I know that from experience. But Dr. Crenshaw describes an incident wherein a guy is holding that rifle. Don't know if it's Hickey or not. I would assume that it is, but that's just an assumption. But he is outside the trauma room during the treatment. Dr. Crenshaw is outside the trauma room during treatment for a moment. And this guy tries to blow by the Secret Service agent. And this guy takes this rifle butt and wham, and hits the guy in the jaw. Seems a bit extreme. And Dr. Crenshaw said that in his mind at that time, he knew that that guy's jaw was busted. But they had the president dying on the table in there, and a busted jaw will wait a little bit. Now, that is the only time that is accounted for. Now, if you've got an AR-15 in an emergency room, that's going to be pretty hard for people to miss. I mean, you're looking at about a 36-inch rifle, 39 maybe. Very difficult to conceal that. But everyone else that even hints at guns sort of talks about pistols. So that's one thing with Crenshaw that I didn't get reconciled, and I really wish that I had.
Did you ever speak to any Dallas police officers? I think this might be one of the things you might have mentioned, that you interviewed someone from the Dallas police. So I thought was interesting.
No, I mean, I ran into a couple at some Lancer conferences. J.M. Poe was one. He, I believe, had marked the Tippit murder shell casings. But the one that I wanted to get to more than anybody was Bobby Hargis. Hargis, of course, was located to Kennedy's left rear. And when Kennedy was shot, Hargis thought that he had perhaps been hit by buckshot.
Because he had blood splatter all over his helmet and
Oh,
motorcycle
yeah,
bike.
he was absolutely covered. And then that beautiful white helmet that, the very, very nice helmets that the Dallas and BJ Martin off to his side was the same way. They were just covered in these things. And, but, Hargis, I found to be very difficult to get to. He was very secretive. I had a friend who was close to Jim Lavelle, and I did get an autograph out of Jim Lavelle, because if anyone hasn't, well, most people probably haven't seen my first appearance. The way that I would get to people would be, hey, would you sign my book? Would you sign my picture? Would you sign this, that, or the other? And oh, well, I got you. Will you answer some questions for me? That was always kind of my MO. But I never got Hargis on the phone to where I could get him to agree. And I'm sure by now he's passed away. In fact, I believe I heard a few years ago that he's passed away. But the police, if you look at somebody like Roger Craig, Roger Craig was with the sheriff's office, and the police department, as a former police officer, I've got a lot of respect for what they did. I also see a whole lot of stuff that they did wrong. They were not, at that time, a real burning interest to me like they would have been after I'd gone into law enforcement. Because after you've gone into law enforcement, the questions to ask about chain of evidence and, well, geez, if you did this, what about your chain? Didn't you just mess that up, jackass? I shouldn't be that way, but there's some of the cases that you go, wow, really? That's what you did? Um, One of the things I've always been interested in talking to police about was the rifle supposedly found on the roof. And then you've got Seymour Weitzman's rifle, which is a Mauser. It's not his rifle as in he found it. He's the one that identified it as a Mauser. But those guys are all gone. And there's a young man now, I believe, that's doing some work on some footage of some stuff related to that. I haven't picked up what he's doing.
Well, after all these years and kind of evolving through the whole JFK assassination literature, research, and all the information that's come out now and the scope, stuff that we still need to be released. I mean, what are your thoughts on the whole JFK conversation as a whole? I mean, are we ever going to get documents released? I see people asking about that all the time. I think a lot of people on both sides just want it released. And then also, people are passing away left and right that are really involved, and we're not going to have a lot of first witnesses that were there that are going to be around anymore. Everything's going to be told from, oh, I heard this from this person, or I heard it from this, which makes it extremely complicated. But do you remain hopeful, or I mean, how have you evolved through this whole thing?
I'm a big believer that nothing critical was written down. So there's not going to be a declassified form one day that says, here's your gunman. Um, Fortunately, I think enough people like me, um, and it's mentioned in Lifton's book after he talked to Malcolm Perry the first time. He said, he talked to Malcolm Perry and he said, a conversation like that should have been recorded. So most people have recorded stuff. I've gotten a lot of stuff in writing. What I found to be a little bit disappointing, and it kind of had to do with why I stopped going to Dallas, really, was after September 11th, there was a real, not a shakeup, but a division that formed in the research community. And half the people turned into 9/11 truthers, which is fine. If that's your thing, that's your thing. But I was going to Dallas for a research conference on Kennedy. And we'd be having these. I remember one talk by Dick Gregory that, I mean, he started on Kennedy and he ended up at RFK and then September 11th and then back to Kennedy. And it was just all over the place. But, the research community, I've talked to one individual who this has been in the last couple of years, and he said, I always kind of wondered what happened to you. You just fell off the face of the earth, and I did. And I'm glad you're doing good. And I said, well, the research community just got a little bit fragmented for my taste. I'll just use that term, fragmented.
Good
And
terminology.
yeah, yeah. And he said, "Oh, you didn't see anything. It got a lot worse than that." And these anymore, these document release things. I mean, you glean one little thing. Oh, Oswald had a pimple when he was 14. Um, you don't get anything substantive, and or at least I don't think the stuff that I've seen. Now have I gone over the however many thousands of pages came out last time? No, but um, I really don't think that any open file is going to bring about a huge, epiphany that these things don't get committed to paper, and and even when they do, okay, say take the for instance the Roscoe White deal. Dallas police officer, his son comes forward and says, my dad's diary says that he was one of the Kennedy gunmen. Okay, well, that sounds pretty good. But okay, well, now we've got to question how authentic it is. Well, some people believe it, some don't. So if you came out with a document tomorrow that said Misters X, Y, and Z arranged for Dallas, people aren't going to believe it. I mean, there's going to be, oh well, there's going to be some that do, but that, oh well, that was fake. That's somebody planted that in the file. I mean, I've always kind of joked about the second coming of Jesus. That if and this is probably, I don't mean it to be sacrilegious, but if he shows up tomorrow, who's going to believe him? There have been so many people that have claimed that. And it's the same thing with the Kennedy thing, that if they open the file tomorrow and there's one document left and it says so and so arranged for it, people aren't going to buy it. So I'm afraid it's just going to fade into the unknown, and that there will never be any resolution on it. But in the meantime, hopefully we find out a lot of other stuff.
We're trying to keep the fight going a little bit, at least when it comes to keeping the conversation of JFK in the discussion. And I appreciate you, Brad, for giving me the time to do this.
I appreciate being on, and you're doing an outstanding job. You just got an amazing guest list. I mean, I'd like to see a list of all the people that you've had, and it's very impressive. You're doing some great work.
Doing what you did back in the day, just trying to get people on the record, for God's sake. So I came at it way too late on this one. It was 58 years late.
Well, I thought I was coming at it late, 30 years later. But the fact that there's people around that still do it is kind of amazing, and you've accomplished a lot. I mean, you really have.
I can't believe I missed out on the damn carousel girls. Dude, I would have loved to interview some of those girls.
Oh yeah.
There's still one alive. I reached out to her.
Oh really?
I forgot her name's Sherry Lynn, I think.
Oh yeah.
She
Yeah.
has a giant mural of Jack Ruby at her restaurant that she has.
That seems a little odd.
She loved Jack Ruby. She said he was a nice guy. All the carousel girls' statements, if you look at them, they all blame the master of ceremonies for saying Oswald was in the club. They said there's no way you could tell by the lights that there was anybody in there. Now, Bill DeMar's statement says that Oswald was in the club, and then that another person stated that he saw Oswald in the club. But all the carousel girls all said either Jack Ruby was a homosexual or he was just like an okay, nice guy, stood up for his girls. Rose Cheramy is the only one that had like a suspicious end to her when she was found like dead in the street and all that.
Yeah, yeah. But what was Ruby doing right before Oswald was shot? One of his girls had a cash flow problem, and he was sending
Yeah,
her
but
money.
that's Karen Carlin, and the fact that they took her statement over Seth Cantor's is complete horse shit.
I know, but they've got a a thing, and he looks out for his people.
In her testimony, they ask her, "Why did you call Ruby to wire you money?" "Because we needed money for rent." "Was the rent due?" "No." "Was the landlord pressuring you?" "No." "All right, move on to the next question." I'm like, motherfucker, ask her why she needed the money.
Probably had to get another fix of smack.
It's just to me, it's so stupid. I'm like, obviously, we know he had associations with Dallas police. That's how he got in there. They didn't just walk up the ramp and walk. He walked in because he knew everybody.
Yeah, and I believe he didn't go down the ramp. I think he went in a door upstairs.
I'm sure he could have
Uh,
easily done that. The interesting thing is, if you
uh,
listen to Officer Clarity, he was one on the fifth floor with Jack Ruby when he was arrested, strip searching Jack Ruby. And he asked Jack Ruby why he did it. And then Jack Ruby just says a statement where he just says, "Because you guys couldn't." And I was like, it's not that you guys wouldn't, but you guys couldn't.
well, he does kind of have a point. You really can't. I mean, you can't shoot a guy in custody.
Yeah, but you wouldn't means like you guys don't have the balls to do this, but couldn't means you guys can't do this, which means that people wanted to do it, or you're insinuating that someone got you to do it.
Well, he may have been thinking that he was reading their minds and the orders that he had, and I do believe that Ruby was acting on orders, of course. I think most people do. Those orders were pretty cut and dry, and they were a lot more free than any Dallas police officer would have been able to do.
And then Jim Lavelle goes and states he didn't know who shot Oswald at the time because they wrestled him so fast. And I go, but aren't you quoted as saying, "Jack, you son of a bitch," when he shoots Oswald?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're talking about a matter of a few seconds. So he may have been wrestling with someone he didn't know who it was, and then when the wrestling's over with and the guy's on the ground, winded, and then he goes, "That's Jack Ruby, that son of a bitch." I don't know. Um, I can't imagine that there was time when Ruby leaps out of the crowd uh, for there to be a lot of conversation. Um, Lavelle was an interesting guy. Another one who chose his words kind of very carefully, from what I gather. I never dealt with him myself, and he passed away several years ago. But he seemed like he was very interested in towing the party line, but yet, why is he even admitting he knew Oswald or Ruby then? You know, because Jesse Curry came out right after that and said, "We found that less than, what did he say, a dozen officers had ties to Ruby." Now, having been a police officer, granted in a small town, the bar owners. I mean, you go there all the time for fights, and you take statements from them and all that stuff. I mean, the cops knew these people, even if they didn't, if even if they weren't patrons, you still know them. Just like you and I had the conversation one time by text, I believe it was, or messenger or something about, Earl Rose wouldn't have gone down to Parkland prior to being called because uh, the media knew who he was. And if the coroner shows up right after the president's been shot, they're going to draw some conclusions that maybe it's a little bit premature to draw. I mean, cops know who people are. I mean, even if they don't know them personally, they can see a person in a crowd and go, "Okay, that's Joe Blow, that he runs the such and such business," you know. But I've kept you long enough, Robbie.
No, you give me enough of your time, Brad. I seriously always appreciate our chats. We'll have to book another one sometime coming up. I'd like to get a panel together at some point, but is there a place where people can find any of your links, or you just want me to link some of the old stuff with your books and stuff?
Just if you just want to run the links, I am on Kindle, and I was upset at the way that the Kindle format came out. I may have covered that before. A friend of mine bought the Kindle, and there are some charts in there of where the wounds were, who saw what wound where that source came from, and each column is a different page. Well, unless you go, okay, Jenkins, that's name number 13 down the list. So let's go to the next page. I mean, it's really not realistic to do. JFKLancer.com. I've gotten several. I posted something on YouTube or on Facebook not long ago, a picture from a book signing that I just stumbled across, and I've gotten more inquiries about my book. People want a hard copy of my book. Unfortunately, there are no more to be had. That was a limited run, just like I told Deborah that it would need to be. But you can get the CD for $12.50, which includes the PDF of the book. But more importantly than that, more importantly than anything that I have said, either today, the last time, or anywhere else, is the talk by Dr. Ron Jones, the full hour and a half talk that's on that CD. That is worth the $12.50 right there. Hear it from the man himself that was there. Don't rely on me. Hear it from him. And that's a gfklancer.liver, if not org.com.
I'll make sure I link those links in the description. And Brad, seriously, thank you again. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. Stay tuned for our next episode.